Hey, good morning. We're continuing on. Listen, today is the last day of the Sermon on the Mount. It has been a really amazing journey just through this set of teachings of Jesus. But this has taken up a number of chapters and well worth our attention, to be sure. But next week we will continue on into chapter 8 and get to see some more of the things he does mixed with the teaching, which will be really interesting. And it's just great story after great story. So that's what the Bible's about, and I look forward to following Jesus through the rest of this whole journey to the cross here. And so here, again, this is the end. This is closing it all up. And so you think back on the different topics that we've had, and Jesus has really gone, an old friend used to say, from soup to nuts. He really covered some ground. He talked about a wide variety of things, tackled a lot of topics. And so this isn't just like the last topic or a set of last things, but he's starting to bring it all together. And that's important. We have to keep that in mind as we're looking at these things. Because one of the most important running themes in the Sermon on the Mount is duality. Matthew loves this stuff. But over and over, we see that there's two choices, right? There's God's way, and then there's the other way. There's only two. And so when we start talking about, how we do things, it's either for God or it's not. We're either treating people the way that God wants us to, or we're not. And it's not, there's not all the degrees. There's not gray areas. It's an either or. And that is really important. And so Matthew is organizing this so we clearly see that this is part of the point, is there's just this stark division. There's one way and the other way. And you got to make sure you get this right. So some would say this is really a bunch of end times related warnings. We'll see if that's true. They're definitely warnings, but over and over, just these sets of two. So let's, I'll read it and then we'll kind of go through and see what we find. So this is Matthew chapter 7. We're picking this up in verse 13. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And that word gate there sometimes is rendered way. It's not really clear which was the better or original saying, but there it is. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, by your fruit, you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. And that's actually the end of the sermon. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. Well, there it is. The narrator comes back. For some chapters now, we've only heard the voice of Jesus teaching us, And it's been challenging, hasn't it? He's really laid some things down for us, some really high bars for us to clear. He expects a lot of his disciples, doesn't he? And you think about this being early in his ministry. He has just really been preaching and calling his first disciples, and out of the crowd, he called his disciples to him. And this is where he kind of lays out, okay, you've responded in faith. Now, let's see what that means. Whew. And he said that to us too. And that's been the hard part. If only the Bible was just about problems other people had to deal with. So let's look first at this idea of two different ways or gates, a pathway, and something you have to go through or along. Not sure which is really the better. Jesus talks about the narrow gate in other places and camels going through the eye of a needle and things like that. But this metaphor, it's not super clear which one really communicates better. So you think about going through a doorway or going down a road, and it's the wide and easy versus the narrow and difficult. Really, that's what it boils down to. But the conceptualization of the way of discipleship is not a single thing. And for that reason, I kind of prefer the idea of way to gate, because there is the word road in the NIV. So I'm not making this up or adding that in, but it's not talking about a single point in time. Like, I walked the aisle at Urbanna Baptist Church or at RA camp or whatever, and it's done. That is not what this is saying. It's talking about a gate, something you pass through, but then a road on the way. So I would contend that what we're talking about here is everything from answering the call of Christ. So Jesus calls all of his children to him. Perhaps the gate is the start of that, answering that call, receiving him in faith. But I think we all know that's just the beginning of our journey. And so then there's that long road, the way of the disciple that ends with us around the throne in heaven, right? And so Jesus is saying, there's a wide, easy path that a lot of people choose, and it leads to destruction. And again, who's he talking to? His disciples. Not a mixed group where he's saying, okay, the smart ones of you, my people, are taking the road less traveled. And it's all of the people out there who don't belong, who have chosen the easy path. That is not what's going on here. He is talking to the church. There's no such thing yet, but that's what it is, okay? Because he called his disciples to him. And this is teaching for his disciples. And he's saying, look, and let me contextualize this. Remember, it's the wrap-up part. So you've got people sitting there still reeling from him saying, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Right? This is good. You have to reorient so that you recognize that it's a good thing when you're persecuted, when your life gets difficult. That's all good because you're following me. And whenever you think of those laws you were raised up with, you got to take them way farther. Forget do not murder. How about don't be angry at people? Get rid of hostility. Focus on reconciliation. Stop thinking of, as long as I don't have sex with a married person, I'm fine. But think about lust within your heart. People are probably still reeling from love your enemies and pray for them. If that had been the whole sermon, you would have had a lot of glazed eyes and people looking around like, is he serious? So, and then he's saying, you got to surpass the Pharisees. When you are being a righteous person, when you're living out your righteousness, giving, praying, fasting, it's got to be better than they do. It's got to be for the right audience, for the right reason. You've got to make sure all your focus is on heaven and not earth. You got to get to the point where you're not looking around and worrying about stuff and clothes and food, but you're worried about the kingdom. It's a complete shift. And then, again, if this had been the only thing. Don't judge other people. However you measure other people up, God's going to measure you up. Whoa. I mean, really. That'll snap your head back. You hear that really fresh for the first time? And so here he is saying, this is a hard path. This is a narrow way. Not many people are willing and able to do this. Most people choose the easy path. He's talking to disciples. Most are going to end up on the easy path. It's wide, it's broad, feels like everybody's heading that way. I want you to take the harder path, the narrower one, the difficult one, because that's what it's going to take for you to be the kind of righteous I want you to be. There you go. That kind of changes things, doesn't it? We like as Christians to think of ourselves as going against the flow of society, which we do. But he's talking about going against the flow of Christian society. Gulp. So again, we're traveling a path from the time we hear God's call and respond to our time in heaven. And anywhere between now and then, we can get off on the wrong exit. We can get off track. This, see, he's raising the bar. This is an urgent decision because he's saying you get on the wrong road, that leads to destruction. If you want to get where you intend to get, it's an urgent decision that you make every single day. Not once a week, every day. And that's going to keep you on that narrow path. Again, just realizing that all of this was said to his disciples completely changed how I read this. And I encourage you to go back and read the whole sermon again and just think, this is not us versus them. This is not insiders versus outsiders. Everything in here is specifically addressed to believers, disciples. So are we willing to make that choice, not once, not twice, every single day, to be on that right path, to choose the hard way? I heard there's a song by a group called The Fray. You may not have heard of them. It popped up on my radio the other day, and the only line I remember was, sometimes the right thing and the hard thing are the same. And boy, is that true or what? That's why it stuck in my mind. And Jesus is kind of saying, if it's the easy way, it's probably not the right way. The hard way is the right way. It's right here. That's a little intimidating. It's why we need each other. It's why we need the power of the Spirit in us. We're not going to keep on that road under our own power. That's just not happening. So anyway, that's the two ways. See, one little section, and now we have all these things to think about. And that's just one part. Then you get this next little section here where he's talking about false prophets and the famous people saying, Lord, Lord, to him at the final judgment. And those go together. It seems like two different things. It is not. Because we've got a couple of different harvests, if you will, two different harvests. And, when we think about false prophets, don't think about, well, I've never called myself a prophet. It doesn't matter if a person says, oh, I am a prophet. Titles do not matter here. This is a matter, and I assume this was happening right then in the church. Pretty sure it's happened ever since. So just rolling with it. So we're thinking prophesying is claiming to bring a word from God. And that's not limited to someone who's in a ministerial role. I do my best to see what God's saying to us, but there are other people, and it could be a pastor. I'm not saying it's not pastors. He's saying anyone who aspires to leadership, who's wanting to tell you what God wants, we have to be careful. So prophesying, that's bringing a word from God, or at least claiming to. And he says there's going to be people who want to be your leaders, who want to tell you which way to go, but they're in line with their own desires instead of God's desires. And it's hard to tell the difference because they say all the right things, maybe do all the right things, but he says there is a way to tell the difference. It's about fruit. It's about fruit because at the end of the day, they are not working to align themselves with the will of God. They're not working on all these things Jesus has talked about. They have other agendas in mind. And so he says you can't rely on people who claim Christ, Lord, Lord, right? People who confess the name of Christ. What does that mean? We are supposed to confess him in every tongue, but that doesn't mean it's someone you can completely depend on. That's not the whole story. And clearly, people who prophesied in his name, that doesn't mean they said the words of God, but said, in the name of Jesus, I tell you, right? Perform miracles. Now, they're claiming this. Whether or not that's true, we're not going to decide. But these are people who are standing before God just sure they've gotten everything right. And he's saying, yeah, but see, here's the thing. I never even knew you. Because it's not about saying the right things or even doing miracles. It's about the will of my Father in heaven. It's about God's will. That's what makes a prophet different from a false prophet. And so one of the words, I want you to catch this. He says, away from me, you evildoers. That's a paraphrase. We don't really have a good English word for that exact thing. It's something more in the flavor of lawlessness, acts of lawlessness, okay? And so that's a term Matthew uses, and we wouldn't notice it just from this, but that's his term that he uses as kind of a general label for the opposite of what Jesus has been talking about. Remember how he says, make sure when you're doing your acts of righteousness. So acts of righteousness are the things we do in service to God, right? And this is acts of unrighteousness, if you will. This is kind of the opposite, things that are not about serving God and doing God's will. And so when Jesus says, away from me, you evildoers, what he's really saying in light of the sermon, away from me, you people who did not do the things that I told you to do to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees. Did not do these things, the righteousness things that I've been talking about. So it ties in more closely than it would appear on the surface. And really, this whole sermon was about righteousness. The whole thing is about taking it to the next level and the real idea of righteousness as opposed to the performance aspect of being a righteous person. And so he's really tying it in here, and he's saying, people who thought they got it right, but weren't aligned with what I commanded. Just going to say, I don't even know who you are. Away from me. So there's clearly, we don't want to follow false prophets, but also a pretty clear end times warning in terms of trees that bear bad fruit. You chop them down, you throw them into the fire. He uses that metaphor a lot in various places. And, that sounds kind of bad, doesn't it? But that fruit, the fruit itself, I don't think it's fruit of the Spirit in this context, though that might be included. But think of what he's been talking about. You're going to see people who aren't performing for an audience of people, who aren't doing things to impress anybody or to gain fame from themselves. You're going to see people who are serious about love and forgiveness and reconciliation and relationships and all of this kind of stuff. They're going to get these things right. They're going to be working on these things. And that's the fruit. This kind of righteousness is the fruit of being in tune with the will of God, as opposed to having your own agenda, And so he's saying, you're going to recognize, because when you are after your own will, you can't deliver this kind of fruit. That's not how the natural world works. It's not how people work. It's not how trees work. You just can't get the wrong kind of fruit out of a tree. And we don't want to get thrown in the fire. I think that's pretty obvious. I don't have to explain that part. And then you get this word, therefore. Because of what I've said, therefore, this last part, this is the closing. And, nothing better than a sermon with a good knock it out of the park closing, right? I wish I delivered more of those. But here he is coming up with this amazing last duality. There's a couple kinds of builders. All of us are builders. I've just talked to you about all the things you can do to build wisely, to keep yourself on the narrow road. And here's how it all comes down. You're either wise or foolish. You're either building on rock or you're building on sand. You're either doing the will of God or you're not. Actually, he says, putting these words of mine into practice, more specifically, doing what Jesus says to do, which I would say represents the will of God. And you're either building something that's going to collapse or you're building something that's going to last. There's only two options. And we want to make sure we get it right. If you want to be on the correct path, if you want to be in the right kind of harvest, you got to be the right kind of builder. And that comes down to one thing. Do you hear the words of Jesus and put them into practice? And again, that is God's will. We have to recognize, everybody had to go through this at some point. Those people, us, everyone has to decide if they believe that the words of Jesus represent the will of God. It seems easy to me, but some people have struggled with that, right? And we have to get that this represents the will of God. And so staying in tune with the will of God requires putting Jesus' words into practice. Not listening to them, not hearing them, not even taking notes in our Bible, but putting them into practice, doing the things that he has just taught us. That's the hard part, isn't it? Because some of those things are quite challenging. And interestingly enough, he was talking to people who lived in a place that had a really serious dry season. I don't think we can really here in Virginia wrap our minds around this idea, but there was a significant part of the year when literally not a drop fell from the sky, okay? So everything dried up. It's basically desert. And it was possible. It was entirely possible and probably had happened where you could build during the dry season and you could build here or there, and either one might look perfectly good, might be perfectly fine. But much as happens in our desert, I've read that this happens every now and then in Las Vegas. They have this huge storm sewer system because of this. So it's dry for all this time, and then suddenly there's a big rain. There's no vegetation to absorb it. So these rivulets and kind of mini rivers spring up. There's torrents all of a sudden. And if that building was on sand, it's done. This was real life. This wasn't just some kind of story, some hypothetical for them. They were all thinking of people who had built during the dry season and not considered what was happening. And see, that's the key. This is not about how well you build. It's not about your skills. This is a matter of intelligence. There's one difference here. It's one builder is thinking about the storm that's going to come, and one is just thinking about right now. That's the difference. Not what's fine right now, but what's going to hold up in the long run. When we are able to recognize that Jesus' words tell us God's will, then we have found wisdom. And then we can build wisely because we can know that what we choose each and every day as we try to stay on the narrow path, what we choose will prepare us for the final harvest. We want to think about what's to come and not what's right now. There's lots of things that seem fine right now, but what's going to hold up? Remember Jesus saying, don't store up your treasures here where things get eaten away. Make sure those treasures are in heaven. See, it's a great example of building for the long haul, thinking about the end of the journey and where we want to be at the end, and not what's going on right now. Whew. All comes together. It's brilliant. It's amazing. That's why it's so famous. Incidentally, this wasn't really a sermon. I'm sorry to throw that out at you. It was dubbed the Sermon on the Mount probably 1,500 years ago by someone that we all revere as one of the fathers of the church. But it's teaching. This isn't preaching. He had done his preaching and he had drawn some people to him. This is where he sits his disciples down and teaches them. It's not done as a sermon. And he's trying to get some really important points through before they continue on their journey. He wants to make sure that people are serious, that they're willing to build for the long haul and not just hanging around. And this is really interesting. Never noticed this before. So here at the very end, when Jesus finishes, there's one last really important point. When Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed. It's a stronger word in the Greek than that English word. More like astounded, shocked. They are stunned by what they have heard because he taught with authority and not as their teachers of the law. But there's two important things in there. One is the crowds reappear. You may recall that when Jesus started healing, crowds just flooded in. So there were crowds, and he called his disciples to him, taught them, but then there were crowds there. The crowds aren't the disciples. This is some other group. It's another group of people. They were there. They were listening. They were paying attention. But they weren't believers. They weren't part of the crew. Isn't that interesting? I think part of what we need to hear, part of it is there's a clear, the crowds are here, then the disciples, then the crowds are back. It's just making it crystal clear. This was done with and for disciples. But the crowd is there. You know, when we come into our church building, we can see people out walking their dogs and jogging or doing stuff in their yard, and it feels like the crowd is separated by our walls. And to some extent they are. But maybe we should be more aware that even when we hunker down and really are doing our nuts and bolts of insider discipleship, the crowd is still watching and listening. There are people who may not share our belief, who might hear things that move them, that impress them, that grab their attention. I feel like maybe part of the struggle of the church, and in my lifetime for sure, has been that when the crowd was listening in, they heard things that turned them off rather than made them amazed and astounded. I feel like we kind of have to assume that we're always being watched and listened to. We've got to be consistent, because I don't want anybody hearing something I said, something we said, something we did, hearing about anything related to Urbanna Baptist Church and being like, count me out. That would break my heart. I want people to see what's going on here, hear the things that we talk about, and be astounded and think, this is different. That's what I want. I would love for that to be our reputation in this community. And so that also shows a little bit of the divide and comes back to our two ways theme. There's disciples and there's the crowd. The crowd heard the same stuff. They were amazed. But that doesn't mean they chose to do the things Jesus said. The children of the Father are the ones who hear these words and put them into practice. The ones that finish the way to heaven are the ones who every single day choose the hard road and choose to do these really difficult things that Jesus has challenged us to do and say, I'm putting these things into practice, even if it's hard, even if it contradicts what somebody on television tells me I should do, even if my beliefs about this issue and that issue contradict what Jesus is saying. What wins? You going to go with talking head on TV, or are you going to listen to the Son of God? Sounds easy to me, but I feel like a lot of people get tripped up there. It doesn't matter if they proclaim Christ. Doesn't matter if they go to church every day. What matters is what wins when all these different things that they're loyal to contradict, run into each other. Does the word of Christ win? Putting those words into practice is what determines our eternity. All the other stuff, it's just earthly stuff. It's the kind of thing that will pass away. We need to think about that. We need to consider carefully, because we all want to be wise builders, don't we? In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.